The Boeing 737 descended through turbulent clouds over Joint Base Andrews, its passenger manifest reading like any other government transport flight. Contractors, mid-level bureaucrats, and a handful of military personnel filled the cramped seats. In 14C, a woman in her late 30s stared out the rain-streaked window, her weathered hands wrapped around a lukewarm coffee cup. She wore civilian clothes, faded jeans, a simple black sweater, and worn leather boots that had seen better days. Nothing about Kestra, Phoenix, Valdez suggested she was anything more than another faceless government employee heading to another forgettable briefing. The young Air Force captain across the aisle had been stealing glances at her throughout the flight, clearly trying to place her face. Something about her bearing, the way she held herself even in sleep, nagged at him. Her posture remained perfectly straight despite the uncomfortable airline seat, and when turbulence jolted the aircraft, she didn't flinch. Most civilians grabbed armrests or looked around nervously. This woman simply opened her eyes, assessed the situation with a single glance at the wing, and closed them again. "Ma'am," the captain finally ventured as they began their final approach, "forgive me, but have we met? You look familiar." Kestra turned toward him, her dark eyes unreadable. "I don't think so, Captain." Her voice carried a slight rasp, the kind that comes from years of breathing recycled cockpit air and shouting over jet engines. Just another face in the crowd. But she wasn't. 20 minutes later, as passengers shuffled through the jet bridge into Andrews Military Terminal, those same dark eyes would scan a crowd of assembled pilots and ground crew with the precision of someone who had once hunted targets at 30,000 feet. The base commander himself stood waiting, flanked by a delegation that included 2 full colonels and a brigadier general. This wasn't a welcoming committee for contractors. As Kestra stepped into the terminal, a young F-22 pilot, cocky, fresh from flight school, with perfectly pressed utilities and an attitude to match, was in the middle of a loud conversation about the old-timers who couldn't hack modern warfare. His voice carried across the terminal as he gestured dismissively toward a group of veteran aviators. "These legacy pilots think they're hot shit because they flew some outdated missions. Half of them probably couldn't even qualify on current systems." The comment hung in the air like jet exhaust. Several conversations stopped mid-sentence. The base commander's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but it was the reaction of a grizzled master sergeant standing near the information desk that caught everyone's attention. Master Sergeant Rodriguez had been at Andrews for 15 years, had seen every type of pilot walk through these doors, from green lieutenants to seasoned aces. His weathered face went pale as recognition dawned. The woman from seat 14C continued walking toward the exit, seemingly oblivious to the growing tension. But Rodriguez knew better. He had seen that walk before, had watched those same measured steps cross tarmacs in places where angels feared to tread. Lieutenant Marcus, hotshot, Williams continued his boastful monologue, unaware that he was about to learn a lesson in humility that would reshape his understanding of what it meant to be a military aviator. The storm clouds gathering outside Andrews were nothing compared to the tempest brewing in Terminal C, where legends walked among mortals and recognition was about to strike like lightning. The terminal's fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across polished linoleum floors, but they couldn't hide the quiet reverence spreading through the crowd of military personnel. Something significant was happening, and everyone could feel it in the electrically charged air of the military installation. The woman in civilian clothes had become the center of a gathering storm, though she moved through it as if walking through calm skis. Master Sergeant Rodriguez stepped forward, his movements deliberate and respectful. His voice, when it finally came, would carry the weight of history and the respect of warriors who recognized one of their own. The young lieutenant's education was about to begin, and with it, a story that would remind everyone present why some legends never truly retire. They simply choose when to reveal themselves again. Rodriguez cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the terminal's ambient noise like a precision-guided munition finding its target. "Phoenix," he said quietly, but the single word carried across the space with the authority of a man who had earned the right to speak legends' names aloud. The effect was immediate and profound. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned with military precision. Even the base commander straightened his already perfect posture. Lieutenant Williams' confident smile began to fade as he registered the sudden shift in atmosphere, though he didn't yet understand its significance. Kestra Valdez paused mid-step, her back still to the crowd. For a moment that stretched like the silence between lightning and thunder, she remained perfectly still. When she finally turned, her expression revealed nothing, but those who knew how to read the signs, the slight tightening around her eyes, the almost imperceptible shift in her stance, recognized the transformation from civilian traveler to something far more dangerous. "Sergeant Rodriguez," she acknowledged with a slight nod, her voice carrying undertones that suggested shared history written in contrails and classified after-action reports. "It's been a while." The master sergeant's salute was crisp, respectful, and entirely voluntary, the kind reserved for warriors who had earned it in the crucible of combat rather than the comfortable confines of a training manual. Around the terminal, other military personnel began to recognize what they were witnessing, though most couldn't yet place the significance of the moment. Lieutenant Williams looked between Rodriguez and the woman, confusion etched across his features. "Wait, who is she?" he asked, his earlier bravado replaced by growing uncertainty. It was Colonel Sarah Martinez, the base operations commander, who stepped forward to provide the answer that would forever change the young pilot's understanding of military aviation history. Her voice carried the weight of someone who had studied the legends and knew their names by heart. "Gentlemen," Colonel Martinez announced, her words measured and deliberate, "you're in the presence of Captain Kestra Phoenix Valdez, call sign earned over the skis of Afghanistan in 2019. She's the pilot who turned a routine reconnaissance mission into the most decorated single-sortie operation in modern Air Force history." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the terminal's background noise seemed to fade as the significance of the moment settled over the assembled military personnel like morning mist over a flight line. Lieutenant Williams' face drained of color as the implications of his earlier comments became clear. Rodriguez stepped closer, his voice dropping to the respectful tone reserved for sharing sacred stories. "Phoenix here didn't just fly missions, Lieutenant. She redefined what was possible in the cockpit of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. The story was about to unfold, and everyone present understood they were about to hear something that would be retold in ready rooms and pilot lounges for generations to come. The weight of unspoken history settled over Terminal C like the heavy quiet before a thunderstorm. Kestra Phoenix Valdez stood at the center of it all, no longer just another passenger but a living reminder of why call signs were earned, not assigned, and why respect in the military aviation community came at a price measured in courage, skill, and sacrifice. Rodriguez gestured toward a quieter corner of the terminal, away from the growing crowd of onlookers. "Ma'am, if you have a moment, I think there are some folks here who'd benefit from hearing about Operation Ghostwalker." His eyes flicked meaningfully toward Lieutenant Williams, whose earlier arrogance had evaporated like fuel vapor in the desert heat. Kestra's gaze swept across the assembled military personnel, young pilots with fresh wings pinned to their chests, seasoned mechanics whose hands had turned wrenches on aircraft that had seen combat, and officers whose understanding of modern warfare was largely theoretical. She saw herself in their faces, remembered the hunger for knowledge that had once driven her own relentless pursuit of excellence in the cockpit. "Ghostwalker," she repeated quietly, the word carrying the weight of classified operations and split-second decisions made at 500 miles per hour. "That's not a story for public consumption, Sergeant." "No, ma'am," Rodriguez agreed, But these are military aviation professionals. They understand operational security, and frankly, they need to understand what real combat aviation looks like. Colonel Martinez nodded her approval. Captain Valdez, if you're willing to share what can be shared, I think it would be educational for our younger aviators. Her tone carried the subtle emphasis of a commanding officer who had just made a strong suggestion rather than issued a direct order. Lieutenant Williams shifted uncomfortably, clearly recognizing that his earlier comments had marked him as the primary target audience for whatever education was about to commence. The other personnel in the terminal began to form a loose circle, their body language reflecting the respect and anticipation of warriors about to learn from one of their own. Kestra looked around the terminal, her eyes settling on the large windows that offered a view of the flight line where F-16s and F-22s sat ready for their next missions. The sight of aircraft on the tarmac seemed to transport her back to another time, another place where the stakes had been measured in lives rather than training scores. October 15th, 2019, she began, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone accustomed to briefing operations where details mattered. Grid coordinates 34, 2 degrees N69, 1 degrees E, Eastern Afghanistan, Kunar Province. What started as a routine ISR mission over Taliban supply routes became something else entirely when we received an emergency call from a special operations team that had been compromised deep in enemy territory. The terminal's ambient noise faded into background static as everyone present leaned in to catch every word. This wasn't just another war story. It was the kind of first-hand account that would be studied in military academies and referenced in tactical manuals for decades to come. Phoenix's hands moved unconsciously as she spoke, her fingers tracing flight patterns in the air that only another pilot would recognize as the muscle memory of someone who had once danced with death at the controls of one of the military's most lethal aircraft. The education of Lieutenant Marcus Williams was about to begin in earnest, and with it, a masterclass in what separated true aviators from those who simply knew how to fly. The flight line beyond the terminal windows seemed to blur as Kestra's narrative transported her audience to the harsh landscape of Afghanistan's eastern provinces, where mountains scraped the sky and death lurked in every valley. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had navigated those treacherous peaks not in the comfort of a simulator, but with live ammunition and real consequences. The call came in at 3:47 local time, Phoenix continued, her eyes now distant with memory. Chaos 17, a 12-man special operations team, had been tracking a high-value target through the Korangal Valley when their position was compromised. Intelligence estimates put enemy strength at over 200 Taliban fighters converging on their location. Lieutenant Williams swallowed hard, his earlier bravado completely forgotten as the reality of modern warfare began to sink in. The other listeners remained motionless, understanding that they were receiving intelligence that most pilots would never encounter in their entire careers. My A-10 was configured for a standard reconnaissance package, Phoenix explained, her hands now moving more deliberately as she reconstructed the mission parameters. 2 AGM-65 Mavericks, a full load of 13 for the GAU-8, and a Lightning pod for target designation. Nothing special, nothing that suggested the mission would become anything more than routine surveillance. Master Sergeant Rodriguez nodded knowingly. He had prepped countless aircraft for similar missions, understood the delicate balance between payload, fuel capacity, and mission requirements that went into every combat sortie. The weather was deteriorating rapidly, Phoenix continued. Ceiling at 800 feet and dropping, visibility less than 2 miles in blowing snow. The kind of conditions that ground most aircraft and turn mountain flying into a death sentence for pilots who don't know the terrain intimately. Colonel Martinez leaned forward slightly, recognizing the setup for what military aviators called a no-win scenario. The kind of situation where all the textbook solutions led to failure and survival depended on instinct, experience, and the kind of split-second decision-making that separated legends from casualties. Standard protocol would have been to abort the mission, Phoenix said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions made in the crucible of combat. Weather below minimums, enemy surface-to-air threats confirmed in the area, and a target zone surrounded by peaks that rose above our service ceiling. Any rational pilot would have turned around and waited for better conditions. The silence in the terminal was absolute now, broken only by the distant sound of jet engines spooling up on the flight line. Everyone present understood they were hearing about the moment when protocol gave way to something more important, the warrior's code that demanded action when lives hung in the balance. But Chaos 17 wasn't requesting extraction, Phoenix continued, her voice hardening with the memory of desperate radio calls crackling through her headset. They were requesting immediate close air support, ammunition running low, casualties mounting, and 200 enemy fighters closing in from 3 directions. They had maybe 30 minutes before being overrun. Lieutenant Williams felt his mouth go dry as the implications became clear. This wasn't just a story about flying in bad weather or navigating difficult terrain. This was about the kind of life-or-death decisions that defined what it truly meant to be a military aviator. The education was just beginning, and everyone in Terminal C understood they were about to learn why some call signs became legends. Phoenix's gaze swept across her audience, settling momentarily on each face as she gauged their understanding of the tactical situation she was describing. The young pilots shifted uncomfortably, perhaps beginning to grasp the enormous gulf between their training scenarios and the reality of combat operations, where failure meant body bags rather than poor evaluation scores. The mathematics of the situation were simple, she continued, her voice taking on the clinical precision of someone trained to process life-or-death calculations at supersonic speeds. Chaos 17's position was at the bottom of a valley, surrounded by peaks ranging from 9 to 12,000 feet. My A-10's service ceiling in those atmospheric conditions was maybe 10,000 feet, and that was pushing it. Master Sergeant Rodriguez winced slightly, understanding the aerodynamic implications better than most of the pilots present. Mountain flying in deteriorating weather conditions was dangerous enough under normal circumstances. Attempting it while carrying a full combat load and planning to engage targets in a confined space was borderline suicidal. The Taliban weren't just randomly positioned, Phoenix explained, her hands now sketching tactical diagrams in the air. Intelligence indicated they had established interlocking fields of fire using both heavy machine guns and shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. They knew exactly where that special operations team was located, and they were systematically closing off all escape routes. Lieutenant Williams found himself leaning forward despite his earlier embarrassment, caught up in the tactical complexity of the situation. This was the kind of real-world problem that no flight simulator could adequately replicate, a three-dimensional chess game played at 500 miles per hour with lives hanging in the balance. My flight lead was Major Catherine Viper Chen, Phoenix continued, a pilot with over 2,000 combat hours and enough decorations to stock a small museum. When I requested permission to attempt a direct support mission, her response was immediate and unambiguous. The pause that followed was loaded with meaning, and everyone present understood that they were about to hear about the moment when command authority collided with individual initiative in the most dangerous possible circumstances. Negative Phoenix, weather's below minimums, terrain's impossible, and you'll be flying into a surface-to-air missile engagement zone with no backup. Return to base. Phoenix's voice took on a slightly different tone as she quoted her flight leader, capturing both the authority and the genuine concern that had colored the radio transmission. Colonel Martinez nodded slowly, recognizing the weight of command decisions that balanced mission success against acceptable risk. Every military leader faced these calculations, but few had to make them while watching friendly forces face annihilation in real time. Standard military protocol supported Major Chen's decision, Phoenix acknowledged. The risk-to-benefit ratio was completely unacceptable by any conventional measurement. One aircraft, impossible weather, overwhelming enemy presence, and terrain that would challenge even the most experienced mountain pilots under ideal conditions. The implication hung in the air like cordite after a firefight. Everyone present understood that they were about to learn why Phoenix had earned her call sign and why her story had become the stuff of military aviation legend. The moment of truth was approaching, and the education of Lieutenant Williams was about to reach its crucial turning point. The terminal's atmosphere grew heavier as Phoenix paused, her eyes distant with the memory of a decision that had defined her career and possibly saved 12 lives. The assembled military personnel understood they were witnessing something rare, a first-hand account of the moment when training, instinct, and moral courage collided at 30,000 feet above one of the world's most dangerous battlefields. I toggled my radio to the emergency frequency, Phoenix continued, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Chaos 17's team leader, Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, was trying to maintain operational security while simultaneously calling for immediate support. His voice carried the kind of controlled desperation that every combat pilot learns to recognize, the sound of professional soldiers who understand they're running out of options. Lieutenant Williams felt his pulse quicken as the tactical picture became clearer. He had trained for scenarios like this in the simulator, but the sanitized electronic environment could never replicate the weight of real human lives hanging in the balance. Any station, this is Chaos 17, Phoenix quoted, her voice taking on the clipped, urgent tone of battlefield communications. We are in contact with overwhelming enemy forces, Grid 340 1692. Immediate close air support requested, danger close authorization granted, repeat danger close authorized. Master Sergeant Rodriguez's expression tightened at the mention of danger close. The military designation for air support delivered so near to friendly forces that any targeting error would result in friendly casualties. It was the kind of authorization that ground commanders only granted when death was otherwise certain. Major Chen's voice came over the radio 30 seconds later, Phoenix continued. Phoenix, you are ordered to return to base. That's not a request, that's a direct command from your flight leader. The silence in the terminal was absolute now, every person present understanding the crucial decision point that separated routine military operations from the actions that created legends. Phoenix stood at the center of their attention, no longer the unremarkable civilian who had walked off a commercial aircraft, but a warrior whose next words would define the difference between following orders and following conscience. I maintained radio silence for exactly 45 seconds, she said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions made in the crucible of combat. Long enough to calculate fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and the probability of mission success against the certainty of 12 American soldiers dying in a valley halfway around the world. Colonel Martinez found herself holding her breath, recognizing the magnitude of what Phoenix was describing. This wasn't just a story about tactical aviation. It was about the moment when individual moral courage overrode institutional authority in service of a higher calling. Viper Lead, this is Phoenix, she quoted her own radio transmission. I copy your order to return to base. However, I am declaring an emergency due to mechanical malfunction. My radio is experiencing intermittent failure, and I am proceeding to the nearest suitable landing area to assess aircraft condition. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Phoenix had just described how she had deliberately disobeyed a direct order while maintaining the technical fiction necessary to avoid court-martial proceedings. It was a masterpiece of military bureaucracy turned against itself in service of mission accomplishment. Lieutenant Williams stared at her in amazement, beginning to understand that he was listening to someone who had redefined the boundaries of acceptable risk in service of her fellow warriors. The thunderstorm outside Andrews was nothing compared to the tempest Phoenix had flown into over Afghanistan, and her story was just beginning to reveal the true cost of heroism. Phoenix's narrative had transformed the terminal into something resembling a combat briefing room, where every word carried tactical significance, and every pause held the weight of lives hanging in the balance. The assembled military personnel leaned forward unconsciously, their training kicking in as they processed the complex decision-making matrix that Phoenix had navigated in real time over the mountains of Afghanistan. The nearest suitable landing area was, of course, the target zone where Chaos 17 was pinned down, Phoenix continued, her voice carrying a subtle note of dark humor that every combat veteran recognized. My radio malfunction was conveniently intermittent enough to prevent me from receiving any further orders to abort the mission. Master Sergeant Rodriguez shook his head in admiration, recognizing the elegant bureaucratic maneuvering that had allowed Phoenix to maintain the fiction of following orders, while simultaneously executing one of the most dangerous close air support missions in recent military history. The weather had deteriorated to the point where visual flight was impossible, Phoenix explained, her hands moving to illustrate the tactical situation. I was flying entirely on instruments through mountain passes that rose above my aircraft's service ceiling, using nothing but GPS coordinates and the desperate voice of Staff Sergeant Santos to guide me toward a target I couldn't see. Lieutenant Williams felt his palms grow sweaty as he processed the aerodynamic impossibility of what Phoenix was describing. Mountain flying required visual reference points and safety margins that simply didn't exist in the conditions she had chosen to enter. The first indication that I had found the right valley came from the sound of gunfire bleeding through Santos's radio transmissions, Phoenix continued. Automatic weapons fire, the distinctive crack of rifle rounds, and underneath it all, the deeper percussion of explosives detonating against rock faces. Colonel Martinez recognized the auditory landscape of close-quarters combat, the symphony of violence that ground commanders learned to interpret like a musical score, where every note carried tactical significance. Phoenix, unknown aircraft, if you're out there, we've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun our position, Phoenix quoted Santos's transmission. Enemy forces are advancing from 3 directions, and we've got 2 urgent medical evacuations required immediately. The tactical picture was becoming clearer to everyone present. This wasn't just a routine close air support mission. It was a desperate attempt to buy enough time for wounded soldiers to be evacuated, while preventing an entire special operations team from being annihilated by overwhelming enemy forces. I began my approach using nothing but instrument readings and the GPS coordinates Santos had provided, Phoenix explained. The ceiling was so low that I didn't break through the cloud cover until I was less than 500 feet above the valley floor, traveling at approximately 450 miles per hour. The physics of the situation sent a collective shiver through the assembled pilots. Breaking through clouds at that altitude and speed in mountainous terrain was the kind of maneuver that killed experienced aviators under ideal conditions. The first thing I saw was muzzle flashes, Phoenix said quietly. Dozens of them, scattered across the valley walls like deadly stars, all converging on a single rocky outcropping where Chaos 17 had established their defensive position. Lieutenant Williams realized he was holding his breath, completely absorbed in a story that was reshaping his understanding of what military aviation could accomplish in the hands of someone who refused to accept the impossible. The real mission was just beginning, and Phoenix's legend was about to be forged in the crucible of combat where split-second decisions determined who lived and who died in the mountains of Afghanistan. The valley materialized before Phoenix like a scene from Dante's Inferno, illuminated by muzzle flashes and the orange glow of explosions reverberating off ancient stone walls. Her A-10 Thunderbolt II, designed for close air support in exactly these conditions, descended through the chaos like a mechanical angel of death, its twin engines screaming their defiant song against the mountain winds. Visual contact with friendly forces, Phoenix continued, her voice taking on the measured cadence of someone reliving tactical maneuvers that had unfolded at the speed of thought. Chaos 17 had established a defensive perimeter on a rocky outcropping approximately 50 meters in diameter, with enemy forces positioned in a horseshoe pattern across the valley walls. The tactical situation was a nightmare scenario from any close air support manual. Friendly and enemy forces, so closely intermingled that conventional weapon systems couldn't be employed without risking friendly casualties. Yet Phoenix had committed herself to a mission that required surgical precision, while flying through weather conditions that made accurate target identification nearly impossible. The GAU-8 Avenger cannon became my primary weapon system, she explained, referring to the massive 30mm rotary cannon that formed the heart of the A-10's combat capability. 7-barrel Gatling gun, firing depleted uranium rounds at a rate of 65 rounds per second. In the right hands, it could place rounds within a 3-foot circle from a mile away. Lieutenant Williams found himself calculating the mathematics of precision fire while flying at combat speeds through deteriorating weather conditions. The level of skill required was beyond anything he had encountered in his training, requiring the kind of instinctive marksmanship that took years to develop. Staff Sergeant Santos was providing real-time target information through his radio, Phoenix continued. Phoenix, enemy machine gun position, bearing 270 degrees from my position, approximately 100 meters. They've got us pinned down and we can't move our wounded. Master Sergeant Rodriguez recognized the deadly efficiency of the Taliban's tactical positioning. They had effectively trapped the Special Operations Team in a kill zone, using overlapping fields of fire to prevent movement while gradually tightening the noose around their prey. My first gun run had to be perfect, Phoenix said, her voice carrying the weight of decisions made at 400 miles per hour. I rolled inverted and dove toward the valley floor, using the terrain to mask my approach until the last possible second. The enemy forces didn't know I was there until the GAU-8 opened fire. The physics of the attack run painted a vivid picture in everyone's mind. 13 tons of aircraft diving at nearly terminal velocity toward a target zone measured in meters rather than miles, with friendly forces close enough that any miscalculation would result in friendly casualties. 30 rounds, 2-second burst, Phoenix specified, her hands unconsciously gripping an imaginary control stick. The machine gun position disappeared in a cloud of pulverized rock and metal. Santos confirmed the threat neutralized, but there were still enemy forces advancing from 2 other directions. Colonel Martinez understood the tactical progression that was unfolding. Each successful engagement would shift the enemy's attention from the ground forces to the aircraft providing support, making subsequent attack runs increasingly dangerous as surface-to-air weapons were brought to bear. The second gun run came under heavy anti-aircraft fire, Phoenix continued, her narrative pace quickening as she relived the acceleration of combat. Tracer rounds streaming past my canopy, the distinctive crack of bullets impacting the airframe, and underneath it all, Santos's voice calling out new targets as fast as I could engage them. The education of Lieutenant Williams was reaching its crescendo, and everyone present understood they were witnessing the birth of a legend forged in the crucible of combat where heroes were measured not by their training scores, but by their willingness to fly into hell for their brothers in arms. The A-10's titanium bathtub, the armored cockpit that had made the aircraft legendary among ground forces, absorbed multiple impacts as Phoenix maneuvered through a gauntlet of anti-aircraft fire that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. The sound of bullets striking armor plating created a deadly percussion section in the symphony of combat unfolding above the Afghan mountains. By the third gun run, the enemy had identified me as the primary threat, Phoenix explained, her voice carrying the clinical detachment that combat pilots learn to maintain while processing life-or-death situations at superhuman speeds. Every weapon in the valley was tracking my aircraft, turning the entire engagement zone into a three-dimensional kill box. Lieutenant Williams tried to process the tactical mathematics of flying repeated attack runs through concentrated anti-aircraft fire, while maintaining the precision necessary to avoid friendly casualties. The level of skill and courage required was beyond anything he had previously imagined. Santos's voice cut through the radio static with increasing urgency. Phoenix continued. "Phoenix, we've got enemy forces advancing on our position from the North Ridge. They're within grenade range of our wounded, and we can't suppress them with our remaining ammunition." The tactical situation had evolved into the kind of scenario that separated textbook knowledge from real-world application. Chaos 17 was running out of ammunition. Their wounded teammates were vulnerable to enemy assault, and their only hope of survival depended on a single aircraft that was running dangerously low on fuel and facing increasingly coordinated anti-aircraft fire. The Northern Ridge target required a different approach, Phoenix explained, her hand sketching flight patterns that illustrated the three-dimensional chess game she had been playing with death. The enemy position was on a reverse slope, protected from direct fire but vulnerable to attack from above. I had to climb to maximum altitude and dive almost vertically to achieve the correct attack angle. Master Sergeant Rodriguez recognized the maneuver Phoenix was describing, a high-angle dive attack that required pilots to fly their aircraft to the absolute edge of structural limitations, while maintaining precision fire control in conditions that challenged both human physiology and aircraft design. "The climb to 12,000 feet took me above the weather layer," Phoenix continued, "and for the first time since entering the valley, I had visual contact with the entire tactical situation. What I saw changed everything." The pause that followed was loaded with significance, and everyone present understood that they were about to learn about the moment when tactical knowledge became strategic understanding, when individual heroism gave way to something larger and more significant. The Taliban hadn't just positioned forces to attack Chaos 17, Phoenix said, her voice carrying the weight of revelation. They had established a complex ambush designed to draw American aircraft into the valley, where surface-to-air missile systems were waiting to destroy any aircraft foolish enough to attempt close air support. Colonel Martinez felt her blood run cold as the implications became clear. Phoenix hadn't just stumbled into a difficult tactical situation. She had flown directly into a carefully planned trap designed to destroy American aircraft and kill their crews. 3 SA-7 shoulder-fired missile systems, positioned on different peaks to create overlapping engagement zones, Phoenix continued. They had been waiting for someone exactly like me, a pilot brave enough or stupid enough to attempt close air support in impossible conditions. The trap was closing, and everyone in Terminal C understood that they were about to learn how legends were forged in the crucible of combat, where death lurked in every shadow and survival depended on skills that couldn't be taught in any classroom or simulator. The revelation transformed Phoenix's narrative from a story of tactical heroism into something far more significant, a masterclass in strategic thinking under pressure, where split-second decisions determined not just the fate of 12 soldiers, but the success or failure of an enemy operation designed to devastate American air power in the region. The SA-7s were positioned to create a kill box with no escape route, Phoenix explained, her voice carrying the analytical precision of someone who had processed complex tactical situations while flying at the edge of human capability. Classic Soviet-era tactics, adapted for mountain warfare and designed to funnel attacking aircraft into predetermined firing solutions. Lieutenant Williams felt his understanding of military aviation shift fundamentally as he processed the implications of what Phoenix was describing. This wasn't just about flying skill or courage. It was about the kind of strategic thinking that separated true warriors from those who simply knew how to operate weapon systems. The dive attack on the northern ridge became my only option, Phoenix continued, but it also meant flying directly through the engagement envelope of all three missile systems. The Taliban had calculated that any pilot attempting to support ground forces would have to use exactly that attack profile. Master Sergeant Rodriguez recognized the deadly efficiency of the trap that had been set. The enemy had studied American close air support tactics and positioned their weapons to exploit the predictable flight patterns that pilots were trained to use in exactly these circumstances. Santos's voice crackled through my headset as I began the dive, Phoenix quoted. "Phoenix, enemy forces are within 50 meters of our position. If you can't neutralize them in the next 2 minutes, we're going to be overrun." The tactical timeline was compressing into a narrow window where success and failure would be measured in seconds rather than minutes. Chaos 17 was moments away from being annihilated, and Phoenix's aircraft was about to fly through a gauntlet of surface-to-air missiles that had been specifically positioned to destroy any aircraft attempting the exact maneuver she was executing. I rolled inverted and dove toward the target, accelerating past the A-10's recommended diving speed, Phoenix explained, her hands unconsciously gripping the edge of the table as she relived the most dangerous moments of her military career. The airframe was shaking so violently that I could barely read my instruments, and the G-forces were approaching the limits of human consciousness. The physics of the dive painted a vivid picture of an aircraft pushed beyond its design limitations, with a pilot maintaining fire control precision while experiencing the kind of physical stress that destroyed lesser aviators. The first SA-7 launched when I was 8,000 feet above the valley floor, Phoenix continued. Heat-seeking missile, designed to home in on the A-10's engine exhaust signature. I had maybe 6 seconds to complete my attack run and execute evasive maneuvers before the missile reached intercept position. Colonel Martinez found herself calculating the mathematics of survival in her head, the time required to line up a precision gun run versus the flight time of an incoming surface-to-air missile. The margins were impossibly narrow, requiring the kind of split-second timing that defined the difference between life and death. The GAU-8 opened fire at 4,000 feet, Phoenix said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. 65 rounds in 1 second, each projectile carrying enough kinetic energy to destroy a light vehicle. The enemy position on the northern ridge ceased to exist. But the mission was far from over, and everyone in Terminal C understood that they were about to learn how Phoenix had earned her call sign while flying through a missile engagement that should have destroyed both her aircraft and ended her story before it could become legend. The SA-7 missile streaked through the Afghan sky like a mechanical predator. Its infrared seeker locked onto the heat signature of Phoenix's twin engines as she pulled out of her dive at barely 1,000 feet above the valley floor. The mathematics of interception were simple and deadly. The missile's flight path would converge with her aircraft's trajectory in approximately 4 seconds, leaving her with a window of opportunity measured in heartbeats. Evasive maneuvers at that altitude and speed were limited, Phoenix explained, her voice carrying the clinical precision of someone who had calculated survival probabilities while pulling G-forces that threatened to render her unconscious. I had enough altitude for one defensive maneuver before terrain would force me into a predictable flight path that the remaining missile systems could easily track. Lieutenant Williams tried to process the three-dimensional geometry of aerial combat, where pilots had to simultaneously engage ground targets, avoid surface-to-air threats, and navigate through terrain that offered no margin for error. The complexity was beyond anything he had encountered in training scenarios designed to challenge even experienced aviators. I pulled the aircraft into a maximum performance climbing turn, dumping chaff and flares while simultaneously transmitting on the emergency frequency. Phoenix continued. The SA-7 detonated approximately 50 meters behind my aircraft, close enough to pepper the tail section with shrapnel.